Hello there, this is SoLinkSmash here. Today I'm going to try something a little different that I hope you guys might actually enjoy. I'm going to be recording a commentary track over my favorite film, or one of my many favorite films, Back to the Future. The first one, released in 1985, directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, and executive produced by Steven Spielberg. So if you want to watch the movie along with me, I'm going to be starting the film with a countdown. So I'll be starting it in 3, 2, 1. Alright. Now, yeah, this is one of my favorite films of all time, and I know a lot about the film. And so I was figured that maybe I would watch it and sort of impart all of the knowledge that I sort of know into one track. So you can just listen to it if you just want to hear the sultry sounds of my voice. Or, watch along with me and enjoy it. Okay. Steven Spielberg presents a Robert Zemeckis film. Now, my sound doesn't really seem to be working. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so Back to the Future. It opens with this huge long shot with all these clocks, which is an amazing feat. This shot alone is fantastic. It's a very long shot. It's only cut. There's only one cut where it cuts away to the dog food. It opens with all these clocks to sort of bring home that point of time. Here you can see someone hanging on a clock hand, and that's a reference both to the end of the film and to the famous Henry Lloyd film where he hangs on the end of a clock as well. Henry Lloyd, of no relation to Christopher Lloyd. Here we see Brown Mansion destroyed, the newspaper article. Everything in this movie is set up perfectly from one point of the script to being paid off later. It's actually, the script has been taught in classes as sort of the perfect screenplay that perfectly shows plant and payoff. Let's see. You also get a look at Doc Brown's sort of mindset as he's living here, and you can see that he does everything automated. Here we get our first hint of the plutonium that's being stolen, which is, the first major plot thing that you're being set up here. Besides, everything up to this point has been seeing Doc Brown's character, it reflected through his breakfast machines. You can see here his toast being burnt and his coffee. Alan Silvestri, by the way, great score. This is probably my favorite non-John Williams music score, if not the best one. This is all had to be built by the production design. So Lawrence G. Paul, well done. This can of dog food. This took a long time, many shots to get to work until they finally got it. This is the only cutaway. That's the first cut of the film. And then it cuts back up, and the can goes in the trash, and we have our first hint of our lead character, Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox. Now, it's famous that Michael J. Fox was the initial choice to play Marty, but couldn't do it because he was working on a TV show called Family Ties at the same time. So, for the first 6 weeks of shooting, they cast Eric Stoltz in the role of Marty McFly. But the film just wasn't working. Here we can see the plutonium there. As a hint that Doc is actually the one that stole plutonium. There is a bunch of inside jokes on this machine that he's hooking up to, this big speaker. There's a reference to Dr. Strangelove, as the code signal for the bomb to drop is also the same as one of these up here, the GA5T. That's the reference to Dr. Strangelove right there. Okay. So eventually they decided Michael J. Fox would work. He was the only thing that could save the movie. So they had to let Eric Stoltz go and then reshoot some of the film. But in the end, it all worked out. Vroom. So that was a stunt double being pulled back there. with all that falling on, and then they had to sort of put Michael J. Fox under all that pile of stuff when they cut away. And there he is, the man himself, wearing his deliciously 80s outfit. Rock and roll, his first line is actually an ad-lib of Michael J. Fox. It's a very annoying telephone. Yes. Christopher Lloyd is Doc Brown. Fantastic. What a wonderful character. He's one of my favorite characters in cinema. If you look carefully, you can see in Doc Brown's garage, there's a lot of items that show up later, or technically earlier, in his mansion, such as like the framed posters of Franklin and Einstein and the like. Here all the clocks go off at once, which I'm sure was hell for the production design to figure out. What gets me about this film is that it's such an 80s film. Like, it opens with like this 80s musical number with Huey Lewis and the News, but yet the film itself is timeless, that like it doesn't feel like it's stuck in the 80s as its time period. Like, you can look at this movie and be like, oh, it's an 80s film, but not in the same way as something like, I don't know, The Breakfast Club or something. Alright, here's our first look at Courthouse Square, which is filmed on the Universal Studios backlot. There we have Lou's Aerobic Center, I believe, which of course becomes Lou's Cafe, and the Cafe 80s, and 2015 and Part 2, and the like. Here we have re-elect Mayor Goldie Wilson. He will come up later. We have some graffiti there. Here's Jennifer, played by Claudia Wells, who gets replaced by Elizabeth Shue in the sequels because of Claudia Wells' family problems, I believe. And here we have Principal Strickland, or maybe not Principal. I can't remember. Anyway, Strickland, played by James Tolkien. There's a lot of exposition in this first, 20 minutes of the film, and it's a testament to the actors of how well they're able to, convey that exposition to the audience without it being, overly trite or obvious that this is all exposition. History's gonna change. And there's Huey Lewis, cameoing as, I guess, the lead guy to decide who's going to be at the Battle of the Bands. The blonde guy with the red guitar is actually Michael J. Fox's actual guitar instructor for this film. And they're playing Power of Love by Huey Lewis and the News. Michael J. Fox didn't play guitar, his recordings weren't in the film, and neither was his singing voice, but he did actually learn guitar for the film. Although he'd previously known guitar, but, learned it better. So, Huey Lewis, you're just too darn loud. It's very funny. Re-elect Mayor Goldie Wilson, progress is his middle name. It's the exact same slogan that'll be used for Red Thomas in the 1950s. if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything, which he would use later for his father, and then his father would tell him later on. We got an adult bookstore back there, and then later on you'll see that there's Orgy American Style being played at the theater, which is hilarious. And then we've got the Save the Clock Tower ladies over there. The 4x4, which will come up at the end of the film. Our first good look at the clock tower there, stuck at 10:04 p.m. The ledge is intact because this is the initial timeline where Doc Brown was never up there. Save the clock tower! There it is, Lou's Aerobic Fitness Center in the back. It's funny because this is exposition for the audience, but it's also like really annoying, which is kind of the point of the character. And the all-important flyer, which will become a necessary plot device later on. Mm-hmm. All right. Now she wrote her number on the back of it, and that's going to be the thing he uses it for. There's Orgy American Style in the background. But of course, the front of the flyer is what's going to become important later on in the film. That's the power makes the world go round. Alright, so he's running the back of he just rides on the back of things. So, Lyons Estates, those little gateways are graffitied. They're pristine in 1955, and then graffitied even more so in the alternate 1985 in Part 2. I'll also be alluding to stuff in the other two films. And here we get our introduction to two pivotal characters in this film, George McFly, played by Crispin Glover, and Biff Tannen, played by Thomas Wilson. They are played by the same actors in 1955 as in 1985, which is actually pretty unique for films to have the same actor play the younger version and the older version. It's very good makeup work. Also, Biff is such an asshole in this film. I mean, that's what makes the character work, obviously, because he is such a blatant, just like, villain, bully, even when he's older. And of course, the hello, everybody home, that comes up later in the film. It comes up in the other films as well. This exact exchange would pretty much go down later on in the film. Show that George McFly has kind of been the same loser his whole life. Crispin Glover was kind of like a weirdo of an actor on set. He was definitely very good. All the actors loved him, but all the crew really did not like him because he was just a pain to manage. He didn't do things that he wanted or whatever else. And then Crispin Glover didn't come back to do parts 2 and 3 because he demanded a salary that was way, way too out of line with what he should have asked for, and he wouldn't negotiate. So they had no choice but to just write him out for the other two films. That's why George McFly is dead for most of the second film. And why he makes very limited appearances in the third and the rest of the second. the way Michael J. Fox had to shoot this film was that he was still working on Family Ties at the same time. So he would get up, rehearse for Family Ties, do recording, and that would get him from probably, I think it was like 8 a.m. to like 4 p.m. And then he'd drive over to Universal Studios and film there, and then and do that through like the late afternoon to the night, and then come home at like 2 in the morning, and he'd be running on 3 hours of sleep like every single day for like 4 or 5 weeks, which was crazy, but he did it. This scene probably has the most exposition of any scene in the film, because you're talking about Uncle Gilbert Joey, who comes up later for a gag. You're introduced to Dave and Linda, Marty's older siblings, and Dave does not work he just works at a fast food restaurant. We've got George being a nerd, even more so, eating the peanut brittle, which was a deleted scene, actually, that Marty was trying to teach him how to be good at confrontation, and a peanut brittle, like a Cub Scout was like coming to sell them peanut brittle, and Marty was telling him to say no, and George just didn't, and just offered to buy the whole thing. And then we got Lea Thompson playing Lorraine, who is incredible, and I will say, Lea Thompson acting old in this film is not necessarily like fantastic. It's good. It works. But she's even better as young Lorraine as well. This is one of my favorite plant and payoffs in the film. I mean, obviously she's like alcoholic drinking vodka, but she asks George, "What were you doing? Bird watching?" And then later on in the film, you see that he's watching different kinds of birds. I mean, he's a peeping Tom. So this is also the scene where we set up how George and Lorraine met, and then how Marty goes back into the past and messes it all up. Meanwhile, George is just stuck watching The Honeymooners on TV. I love George McFly's laugh. I love his whole character, honestly. This is Time Bomb Town, I believe, playing on the radio. I can't remember who. I can't remember the artist, but that was like one of the few things that was on the Back to the Future album that came out around this time, which wasn't very good. I mean, it had the Huey Lewis songs, and it had like one like medley of the score, and then a bunch of like other songs that are barely in the film. Alright, so this scene here, where Marty meets Doc and the DeLorean for the first time, is like one of the best scenes in cinematic history, in my opinion. So here we've got Marty at Twin Pines Mall. The Twin Pines Mall sign is very important, and it's one of the more sort of famous changes in the time, I suppose. Alright, this is an interesting shot, because depending on which version of the film you're watching, this is different. So right now his skateboard has yellow wheels, and then right now when you cut back to it, in the Blu-ray digital versions, they're still yellow, but in the DVD version, and the theatrical versions, and VHS and all that, those wheels were now pink. So if you were watching on one of those, you could see that, but if you're not, then they remained yellow, because they just fixed it, which is kind of a shame. One last thing I can show you. So this is the amazing theatrical introduction of the DeLorean time machine. Definitely one of the greatest movie cars ever invented. Oh man. I have a die-cast model of this. I've always wanted like a DeLorean because of this film, even though they're really crappy cars, which is kind of helps the plot, honestly. And here we've got Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown. Oh, I know every single line of Doc's in all 3 films. Doc Brown is so inspirational for me. If you've played the Back to the Future game, this is the part that's in the intro as well, during Marty's dream, and it all goes wrong. And I mean the Back to the Future the game by Telltale Games, not the really bad NES game. So here we got Einstein, who's Doc's second dog that we see, because his first dog, Copernicus, he has in the 1950s, which is the same breed of dog. Now, in the faraway shots with the DeLorean moving, and you can see the dog, it's not a real dog, it's a guy in a dog suit. So, like this shot, for example. That's just a guy in a dog suit. Trying to see what else about the DeLorean can I say. Well, there were 3 DeLoreans made for this film. There was the A car, the B car, and the C car. The A car is the main model that had everything decked out on it. The B car was the one used for faraway shots like this, or stunt work. That didn't need as much detail on the interior. And the C car was cut in half so that they could film shots in the interior of the car, because the car is very small and they couldn't fit a camera inside. The B car was the one that ended up being destroyed at the end of Back to the Future Part 3 by the train. And then the A car has been restored and is now, I believe, at Universal Studios. We got the first time travel here. What a famous moment. This is one of the few special effects shots in the film. This film does not rely a lot on special effects. It's mostly a character drama. And we got the famous fire trails. Yes. The famous rotating license plate, which gets emulated in Part 3. I always surprise people when I'm like, you guys realize Rick and Morty is based on Doc and Marty, right? And they all, their mind is blown, but, I knew it from the beginning, because the first time I heard Rick go, Morty, I was like, oh, that's Marty. It makes a lot more sense. Out of a DeLorean? Yep, sends the DeLorean 1 minute to the future. So the idea is, when the car goes into the time travel, it becomes hot and leaves the fire trails, and when it comes back, it's cold. That doesn't really make any sense, but it's cool. Here we've got those fans at the back that's sort of letting off the steam from the nuclear reaction taking place inside. Those are CO2 vents, I believe it's supposed to be. I'm not really into my nuclear science. This movie made me want to be a scientist, but then I didn't. So the crate of plutonium is over there now. Alright, the funny thing is that this display here, where like you would input the button, and then you would input the buttons on the keypad and then it would show up on the screen. Those didn't actually work on the original A model car. This was just like done in post here. That's a funny joke. December 25th, 0. Robert Zemeckis says that's one of his favorite jokes in the film, but no one ever laughs at it. And here we go, some more exposition where he talks about how he came up with the idea for the flux capacitor, which comes up later, and that's what Marty uses to convince Doc that he's really from the future. Now, you can't, well, the flux capacitor is kind of a joke because you can't have a capacitor for flux. It's just all technobabble. Although gigawatt is actually a scientific term, although it's pronounced gigawatt. And then here we go, Doc talking about Old Man Peabody owning this land and having it breed pine trees. That's kind of random, but like Doc makes it work because he's got this sort of like wild-eyed look in his eyes. And then of course that is the first thing to really get paid off as soon as he goes into the past. Here's Gigawatt. Doc is very dangerous in this first film. Also, this whole thing with the Libyan terrorists, like, that's not really something you could do nowadays. I saw a version of this film on cable TV, and they like cut this the entire chase sequence. Like they just decimated it. Like it was like nothing was left. You didn't see Doc get shot. You just sort of saw Marty get in the car, and then they did a bunch of weird random shots, and then suddenly Marty's in 1955. It was really bad. So Marty here's got his radiation suit, which will come up later, because that's what he's wearing when he goes back into the past. Doc's luggage here includes the hairdryer that Marty wears when he pretends to be Darth Vader, so that's where it comes from. It's also got, like, some porno mags in there. That was in a deleted scene. That World Series line, of course, would come up in 2015, where he goes there and sees the Cubs won the World Series in 2015. Which, unfortunately, of course, they didn't, but they did in 2016, which was pretty funny, actually. And then, of course, he notices, like, oh, I should have brought plutonium, otherwise I'd just be stuck there. And then just, it happens that, like, he has no time to put them in there so that Marty will be stuck. The Libyans. Holy jeez! In the cable version. I believe Doc's gun here is the same one he fires in part 3. Which is a nice detail that they kept in part 3. Then here, of course, we see Doc get shot. Now, in this timeline, I believe this kills Doc. But then when Marty goes back and changes the timeline, Doc will survive. Now Marty just barely escapes with his life here. There's an urban legend that the shot of Marty jumping into the car there is actually Eric Stoltz. But there's really no way to know for sure. It could have just been a Marty stunt, Michael J. Fox's stunt double. And then here we've got this chase sequence here with the excellent Alan Silvestri score. When he shifts the gears, he accidentally turns on the time circuits. And he turns them back off again. Now, at this point, I'm fairly certain Marty is not planning on time traveling. He's just trying to escape from these guys. They're just not very good at aiming, I suppose. He's driving very fast. I believe this sequence was shot over 6 nights. Oh, here we got the rocket launcher. I watched this with a friend of mine a few years ago, and he was laughing so hard at so many things. It's because I had seen this movie so many times that I kind of forgot it was a comedy. This is a very funny film. And here we got the time travel, the first time travel. See, the shots from the interior there were shot from the C car. Now, there's a little continuity error here because he drives into the barn with the front of the car facing the back, but then when the Peabodys go to check on it, they find that the front of the car is now facing the hole where he just came out of. But, you know, it's fine. Now, that's Mr. Peabody, and I believe his son is named Sherman, which, you know, is a reference to Peabody and Sherman. And here the DeLorean's gull-wing doors makes it seem like it's an alien spaceship, and then we've got Marty coming out in his radiation suit. And this was that was one of the main reasons they chose a DeLorean, besides the fact that it was an 80s car that looked really cool. But because it had the gull-wing doors, they could sort of do this joke where people thought he was an alien. In fact, there's the famous anecdote that Sid Sheinberg, who was in charge of Universal, said that the film should be renamed Spaceman from Pluto in reference to this joke, and changed some other stuff to make it, you know, Spaceman from Pluto. But Back to the Future was a much better title. Take that, you little mutated son of a bitch. It's one of my favorite lines in this film. I'll be saying that a lot, though, because I love this entire film. Now, this is important. So, he runs into the second pine. So, it now changes from 2 pines to 1 pine, and that'll come up later. Now, actually, there was a deleted scene in the second film, which I don't know if was ever shot or if it was just scripted, of Mr. Peabody shooting at the flying DeLorean when Doc is in 1955 and is on his way over to the high school to pick up Marty, where Mr. Peabody's shooting at him for running over his pine. But that got cut. And then here we see where Lion Estates would be. Now, obviously, those like Lion Estates gates there would not be there like at that point in the development, because if it was still just like a plain or like a farmland, they wouldn't have that there. But that's just to bring home the idea that that's what that will be. That's actually a very subtle joke, and that I never understood until I grew up and I realized that, oh, because he's in a radiation suit and it's in the 50s. So they think he was radioactive or something. And then here, the DeLorean's not starting, which people would think would just be, oh, of course, plot convenience, the car doesn't start. But actually, it's because the DeLorean is a really crappy car with not a great engine. So this was a common symptom of the DeLorean. The car is probably way too heavy in order for him to actually move it like that, but it's a movie. It's fine. And here we got Mr. Sandman for the introduction into the 1950s courthouse square. And then this song was reused in part 2 as the other Marty is following Biff into town. We got a film starring Ronald Reagan going on there. Castle Queen of Montana, which will set up the later joke of Ronald Reagan being the president in 1985. This whole sequence is set in the Universal backlot, which is sort of where all these films were shot to begin with in the 50s, so it kind of has that vintage look anyway, that it looks like old 1950s movies. Very good production design here. Oh, man. Now we got a little plaque to World War II veterans there, and Korean conflict. You can see there at the bottom, we've still got some veterans from the Korean War. And now, of course, the clock tower is still working at this point in time. And then here we see re-elect Mayor Red Thomas with the exact same slogan as Goldie Wilson. He's in 1955. Alright, he's gonna go call Doc. And this is now Lou's Cafe. We got the Ballad of Davy Crockett being played there. A reoccurring joke in the film that his 1980s fashion vest is interpreted by everyone to be a life preserver, so he's a sailor or from the Coast Guard or something like that. Emmett is spelled wrong. It's actually spelled with 2 T's. His 80s electronic watch. It's not a bomb. I'm not sure if you're allowed to just, steal a page from the phone book, but whatever. So Marty wants a tab and a Pepsi Free, which are 2 diet sodas from the 1980s. And, of course, Lou, the bartender there, misinterprets both of his requests as wanting, a tab for, a restaurant and then a free Pepsi. And here we got Biff and his gang. So Biff's gang is 3D, Matches, and Skinhead. Matches is played by Billy Zane before he was famous. And then we got Skinhead over there. J.J. Cohen, I believe, is the name of the actor, who was originally cast to play Biff Tannen. Except Eric Stoltz was originally super tall, so that wouldn't really work because J.J. Cohen is not as tall. Also on that note, Claudia Wells, who played Jennifer, was actually also originally cast, but then had to be replaced because because she couldn't do the film, and so the actress who was then cast to play Jennifer was cast alongside Eric Stoltz, but then when Eric Stoltz was replaced by Michael J. Fox, she was too tall. So then Claudia Wells was back in the film. And then this is the moment where he realizes sort of what this whole film is going to be about. Michael J. Fox looking over, and it's George McFly, his father. And here's Goldie Wilson before he becomes mayor. Mayor. Oof. Now, this location here is used in a lot of films. Back to the Future crew was location scouting for this film during the filming of another movie called Teen Wolf, which starred Michael J. Fox. And that's how we first found out about the film Back to the Future, was hearing this location scouting. And he's like, man, I would like to do something for Spielberg. Not knowing that, of course, he would end up being cast in it. And there's George birdwatching, and then Marty rescuing him and taking his place in multiple ways. Lorraine's mother was named Stella just for that joke. Which, of course, is a reference to Streetcar Named Desire. Here's the first Mom Is That You scene. The first in 3 for all 3 films. Here we get our first look at as Lea Thompson as the young Lorraine Baines, who becomes Lorraine McFly. Michael J. Fox is so funny. So she calls him Calvin because his underwear is Calvin Klein underwear, which is like the idea that in the 50s people's names would be embroidered on their underwear. It's just an excuse for the teenage Lorraine to take off his pants. It's amazing that they were able to sort of get past the whole thing that she's his mother, and he's so uncomfortable with the whole thing, and she's totally into it. Michael J. Fox definitely brought the physical comedy. You can see her reflection in the mirror there as she sort of looks at him, and all the Elvis cards back there. he he says he's Coast Guard just to go along with it. We got Sam Baines there. Milton, Sally, Toby, and Joey, the Baines family. And there's the payoff for Uncle Joey being in jail. Also, just in any timeline, Uncle Joey's always in jail, because Uncle Joey is also in jail in the alternate 1985 in part 2. The coonskin hat. I love it. Wow, you must be rich. Of course, Doc actually has at least 2 TV sets, probably just 2, in his mansion. And of course, he is rich at this point. This is the setup. This is the payoff from the previous setup of George watching this exact scene earlier on. It's a Peanuts character. This is funny. It says John F. Kennedy Drive. And he's like, who the hell is John F. Kennedy? Which is, he's not president yet. But I mean, the Kennedy family was pretty, politically active even before that, so. You would think that she sort of get the hint that he's not about her advances, but I don't know. But I guess she's just too dreamy in love. So we have the garage that he later stays in because his mansion burns down. That's the gamble house actually used for the brown interior, or exterior rather. I mean, here we have our first look at the 1950s Doc Brown, which is pretty much the same, except his hair is a little bit blonder. He's got less wrinkles. Of course, his mind reading device just is completely off, and he's just sort of guessing. The Coast Guard Youth Auxiliary, because he's wearing this life preserver. And his dog there is Copernicus, not Einstein. As much as you must love dogs, they don't survive for 30 years. cut off your brother's hair. That's already a hint that, like, he's already being erased from existence. When Back to the Future was screened for Reagan at the White House, he laughed so hard that he asked the projectionist to stop it and then rewind it and watch that one joke 3 times. And then later he would reference Back to the Future in a State of the Union address. John DeLorean, who was the designer of the DeLorean DMC-12 car, also wrote a very touching fan letter to the Back to the Future production team, thanking them for using his car in their film. Flux compression is what's written on the actual sheet itself. How one can compress or capacitate flux, I don't know, or what that has to do with time travel, who knows. Oh, and 88 miles per hour was picked because it was easy to remember. Now, it's probably not possible to hook up a JVC camera to that TV. And there's even a wire that falls out if you look carefully when he picks it up. He assumes that there's atomic wars. That's a photo of Thomas Edison. At this point, they considered him the inventor of electricity. But we all know it was Nikola Tesla. We're not inventor, but you know what I mean. The light bulb. I'm talking about the light bulb. See, the audience sees that it's to save the clock tower, even though he's showing him that, like, it's actually just Jennifer's phone number. And then, of course, at this point, we're like, oh, yeah, the bolt of lightning, that's it. So the audience is aware of it before he says it. Christopher Lloyd says that he based Doc Brown's performance on a mixture of like Albert Einstein and Leopold Stokowski. Stokowski being the famous conductor, where he's got all of these like hand movements and like powerful physical motions to reflect what he's saying. Stokowski was also the conductor in Fantasia, so you might recognize him from that. So the idea of time travel as it exists in this universe is consistent and practical, and that when you travel back in time or forward in time or whatever, when you change the course of time, you create different timelines. So at this point, with Marty being here and bumping into his parents, he's created a different timeline that threatens his existence. If this timeline continues, if the course of events of this timeline continues further, Marty will no longer exist, and that will cause a time paradox that will destroy the universe or whatever. So, but the main thing for him is that he'll be erased from existence. But the way it works in this film is there's a ripple effect where the effects of changing the timelines are not instantaneous. They take place over a course of time, in which that the time traveler has the opportunity to sort of fix it. That's why the stuff like the changing photographs in newspapers and stuff just gradually shifts from one to the next. That's the ripple effect that gets explained in 2 and 3 with a little greater detail. The redheaded kid with the braces there on the right ends up actually, I believe he's the one that cuts in to Lorraine and George's dance at the end. And he was in a deleted scene where George is late to sort of intercept Marty and Lorraine, and ends up intercepting Biff and Lorraine because he got locked in a phone booth by that kid. Also, I just love Doc trying to act conspicuous in this high school. She doesn't even see George. And George is just so awkward that he just, leaves immediately. Over time, Doc learns how to love. Rhythmic ceremonial ritual. That's my favorite way to refer to dances. Be there or be square. Actually, there was a deleted scene before the previous one where he goes in and he sees that his mother's cheating on a test. But it wasn't really important to the plot, so they cut it out. George's insecurity here about his stories is set up by Marty's insecurity about his music to show that they're really not that different. Oh boy, and we got Biff here. Ooh. This is where Marty's fighting attitude sort of gets the best of him. Here comes Biff's one of Biff's most famous lines in the film. Even 3D over there is like, really? And George is gone. Which was an actual TV program in 1955. The time here doesn't really run consistently. It's been like a day, but then like later on it's not until like Saturday that his sister like finishes, and then it's all of him at once somehow. So that hairdryer does come from Doc's luggage in the DeLorean. We got some Eddie Van Halen, which I guess could be interpreted as a scientific torture device. The scene was also originally much longer and ended with Marty knocking George out with chloroform. Which is why George says that he oversleeps in this scene, because of being knocked out by chloroform. This is a funny joke, because at that point you can't twist off those caps. When it came to product placement in these films, the filmmakers wanted products that had changing logos and stuff over time so that they could have them in the 50s and the 80s and show like how they were different. So you can see that when it came between like Pepsi and Coke, for example, only Pepsi had changed its logo from the 50s to the 80s. So they decided to go with that one just to see like those differences. The same went for something like Texaco. You can see Marty in the background sort of watching this go down. He says destiny wrong and it's density. As in his stupidity. And Marty just can't help himself, can he? This shot really shows, like, how much taller he is than Michael J. Fox. Michael J. Fox is not that tall. Boom. And then, of course, that shot would be paralleled. Both those shots would be paralleled in part 2 as this entire sequence. Where he invents the skateboard. Now, of course, there's no way that that would operate as well as a 1980s skateboard, but it's a movie. And here, him riding on the back of cars comes back. Here we got Biff's 46 Ford. It's a nice car. It's funny because in the 80s, the 50s was like as nostalgic as the 80s is now. I always feel bad for this couple that just like gets all of their papers flown everywhere and then has both him skateboarding and Biff driving over them, and they have to pick them up. I don't know, I always felt bad for them. Oh, here we go. The first of many manure takes. Shit. I believe that cost $300 of damage to his car, which will come up both in this film and in part 2. Lorraine's friend on the right, who I can't remember the name of, actually comes back in part 2 as well. Also, Lorraine's just, stalking Marty, following him back to Doc's house. Nothing weird about that. This is the first hint of we can see that Marty is hiding Doc's future from Doc, and Doc eventually figuring it out, or something. Oh, I love this scene. I've always wanted to build my own model of Hill Valley and recreate this entire thing. Just not with the electricity and the fire, though. I believe it's an actual 1950s wind-up toy. And then he gets caught on fire. I like how it's a watch face as the clock face on that tower. It's a nice detail. I like how he could just do this with like a pencil, but he builds this whole elaborate model with actual electricity to demonstrate it. It's great. Also, I like the saxophone on the wall. I'd like to see if Doc Brown ever played saxophone. Whoa. That car actually would show up in part 3 as well. That face Doc just made was a Rage comic meme for a while. This scene would later be emulated in part 3, when Claire comes and they have to cover the time machine. This is actually the only scene in all 3 films that Doc and Lorraine both have, which is funny because in real life, Lea Thompson and Christopher Lloyd had met before and worked together, but this is their only scene in all 3 Back to the Future films. The looks that Doc gives Marty in this entire scene is some of the funniest stuff in the movie, in my opinion. I always think it's really funny at the beginning of the scene where she calls him Marty and then Calvin and then Marty again. I should probably mention at this point that the idea for Back to the Future came from Bob Gale looking through his father's high school yearbook and finding out that his father was actually the class president. And Bob Gale thought about his class president in high school, and he had nothing to do with him. And so he wondered, if he went to high school with his dad, like, would he be friends with his dad? And that's just the whole idea of that, and the fact that both Zemeckis and Bob Gale loved time travel movies like A Christmas Carol and H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. And that all sort of got wrapped up into the one Back to the Future script that they shopped around to a bunch of studios. But at the time that they first shopped it around, they didn't get any... No studio wanted to touch it because it wasn't dirty enough for most studios, but it was too dirty for Disney with the whole, like, mom incest thingy. So it was a difficult script to sell, and they had to put it away eventually and do other things. But once Robert Zemeckis' film Romancing the Stone was a big hit, he was able to make Back to the Future. This scene was originally, like, extended and in the original script, I believe, and had there be a setup for George punching with his left hand instead of his right, which was actually his dominant hand, and the idea was that he was born left-handed, but that his parents forced him to use his right hand, which sort of contributed to his self-esteem issues, and that you'll notice in the final film, it's his left hand that docks the powerful punch on Biff. This scene was also originally extended before Marty leaves and asks Doc, Doc, this could really screw me up, like referring to him having to, like, potentially assault his own mother. He's like, what if I go back to the future and I end up being gay? And Doc answers, why shouldn't you be happy? It's a great line, but I see why they cut it. It was probably just a bit much. Oh, this is also one of my favorite cues in the film, like musical scores. And at this point, Doc has no idea that he's going to die. in that he doesn't want to know. But that's not enough for Marty. It was recently noticed by a foreign fan that the letter that Marty writes here, and then the letter that's taped by Doc at the end of the film, is not actually the same letter. Like, they're formatted differently. I believe the message is slightly different as well. But this was only noticed, only a year ago, and this film's been out for over 30 years. So it's amazing that literally no one has noticed until then. Or at least, it was never public knowledge until then. Doc in part 2 alludes to the fact that he explained it was a weather experiment. And he's actually just paying off the policeman here. He doesn't have a permit. And that was explicitly shown in that same deleted scene I was talking about. Here we've got Marvin Berry and the Starlighters. How I wish that my high school dances had an actual live jazz band like this. They're playing Night Train, which is sort of like a jazz staple. It's very ornate, too. This whole Enchantment Under the Sea dance. Bing, bing, bing. Oh, poor Marty. Why did he ever feel like he had to go through with this? It's just Marty's now seeing his mother do all this stuff. Like, I've never parked. I've drank and smoked and stuff. There was an outtake where they actually filled that prop bottle with real alcohol. Note that speaker is on a Pepsi box. It'll be gone later. See, this is the part where he realizes it's almost 9 o'clock, but he doesn't actually get there until much later because he's locked inside that phone booth. It's just like, Marty's like, you're hot, but you're my mom, and why would I... This is like the only thing that makes this whole incest thing like okay in this movie, is that she's like, it's like I'm kissing my brother. And it's like, oh, it's George. But it's not George, it's Biff. And this is pretty heavy stuff. I mean, he's attempting to rape her right here. Yikes. Messing up my hair. Ooh. Spook and Peckerwood are two antiquated racial slurs. Yikes. But by the time George gets there, he's like, oh boy. Meanwhile, the part 2 Marty is up in Strickland's office. This is also part of what makes the story timeless. It's just a classic case of like the nerd, like, well, maybe not the nerd, but just like the guy with low self-esteem gaining his courage and defeating the bully. But of course, in the process, he slices his hand. Now, of course, this punch is a lot more telegraphed than the last one, but it's his left hand, which is his actual dominant hand. Boom! See, look. It's been days, but like his sister's only halfway gone, and he's only got like a few minutes left, basically. Also, there's no way it's like all this takes place in like half an hour real time. I'm just saying. And here's his guitar playing, paying off. And here's Earth Angel. See, look, his sister's already gone. And as opposed to just disappearing in parts like his siblings did, he just disappeared. He starts to disappear at once. Look, this is the kid that locked him in the phone booth. Probably the only criticism you could probably conceivably give of this movie is this whole sequence here where he's just like, ha 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 ha, like steals her away and he turns his back for a little bit. Like, that's really not necessary. Also, this is the only bad special effect in the film. If they had an extra 2 weeks, they could do it. But they needed to get, ILM needed to get the shot out because they moved the release date of the film up. It was originally supposed to be in August, and I think they moved it to like June or May. I can't remember. But they moved it up a few months, so that was the best version of the shot they could use. And with the kiss, his future is secured, and Alan Silvestri's orchestral score comes in underneath Earth Angel. It's a great moment. Let's do another one, even though you messed up half of the previous song. Now this is pretty much the only scene you could take out of the film and it would still work. Like the movie would still work. But it's such a fun scene that like it doesn't matter that this is still in. In fact, this is one of the first ideas the filmmakers had, is that Marty would go back in time and invent rock and roll. And he's going to be playing Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. I mean, you could say that there's a problem here of, historical revisionism by saying rock and roll was actually invented by a white man. Even though he's playing, like, a Chuck Berry song, don't think too hard about it. And, of course, now, part 2 Marty is sneak around in the background up in the rafters. I don't know about you, but this happens all the time at my school dances. And that's not Michael J. Fox's singing voice. And here's Marvin is calling his cousin Chuck Berry. And it cuts to Marty doing the Chuck Berry waddle there. I'm not up in my guitar terms, so maybe it's called something else. And he's doing all this history of rock and roll all in here, and everyone else is sort of being like, all right. Doing the windmill and the picking there. So eventually everyone just stops. Because they're like, what the hell is he doing? See, now the Pepsi bottle underneath the speaker is gone. Or Pepsi box, rather, not a bottle. And everyone just stares at him. Educational. It's one of my favorite lines in the film. He sets fire to the rug, go easy on him. As a kid, like, I'd be like, I wish I could do that. But still, they named their first son Dave anyway. That's fine. Oh, this is a good sequence here. With an amazing score as well. I like how he just has 3 watches in addition to the big clock tower. He's like, the timelines could change. Now, there's a fan theory that I think probably has some merit, and that the way the space-time continuum works in these films, that it always tries to correct itself. So if there's a way for, like, paradoxes to be avoided, then they will be. And the theory is that Doc's calculations were wrong, because when the alarm goes off, Marty doesn't actually go on the exact time the alarm goes off, so he technically should miss the lightning, but he gets it. So the theory is that it's the space-time continuum preventing the car from starting until he absolutely, until he actually is supposed to start. It's a good theory. Don't tell Matt Pat. I don't know if he does film theory on it yet. I don't know. I think Marty's, right to do that. Especially because he's like, don't open it for 30 years and you'll be fine. And I just like how he keeps it, and then Doc is later like, well, I figured, what the hell. Mellows with age, I suppose. Now, poor Christopher Lloyd actually had to go up onto the top of that windowsill for those wide shots, where you could just see the top of it, and when he's hanging on the clock and stuff. That was all built on a soundstage, but he actually had to go up on the back lot set there for some of those wider shots, the one tilting up. Those statues are from the Universal film The Cat People, which I want to say was one of the Universal monster films. If you've seen, the Universal backlot has been used in a ton of movies. It's most famous for its use in the Back to the Future series, obviously. But if you've seen the first Twilight Zone episode, Where Is Everybody? I think that's another fair example. If they use pretty much the entire backlot, and you can see it's definitely the same courthouse square. I think it caught on fire a few years back, and so I don't know how much of the Back to the Future courthouse is still there, but the whole clock part on the top was added for Back to the Future, but it stayed there since because it's just so iconic. Well, not really less than 4 minutes. I want someone to, like, actually time out all the events in this film and see, like, if there's any way that this could happen in, like, 3 minutes. So, like, that shot was on the set. That was actually, like, on the back lot. And, of course, the ledge will fall off, and that ledge will remain off in the timeline Marty returns to, as well as 2015 in part 2. This is also a thing where if he went back 10 minutes, like, he would run into his younger self. So this is another thing where the whole thing with the DeLorean not starting once he gets back to the future, or the present, is to prevent him from running into his younger self, and thus preserving the space-time continuum. See, what Marty should have done is he should have gone back, like, hours, so that he didn't run into his younger self, and so that it would give Doc ample time to actually prepare. But, you know, he was stressed out. So I'm sure he wasn't really thinking straight at this point. There's the ledge. And then there's him hanging on the clock tower, just like the guy at the beginning of the film on his clock. And just like Harry Lloyd in that one silent film. Now, I just gotta say, like, Doc has gotta have some amazing upper body strength in order for him to stay on. Cause, like he's literally hanging on to that. He's hanging on with one arm right there. Like, okay, sure. See, look, the alarm goes off. And he doesn't actually leave at the right time. But he still makes it. Because Doc's calculations were off by a few seconds. Oh yes, the wonderful Back to the Future score. Nostalgia Critic rated the Back to the Future theme as, like, the most, like, fuck yeah movie theme of all time, and I'd be inclined to agree. Of course, he pulls it and messes it up. Now, it raises the question, if the clock tower was, like, the tower itself was the one being struck, then why did, like, the clock itself stop? And in this timeline, it makes a lot more sense because the electricity is now running through the clock as well as just hitting the top of the tower. So that's probably why the clock stops, although that doesn't really cover the original timeline. No matter how impossible the stunt, it's a movie. And a great movie. And here it is. Boom. That lightning striking the clock tower, this whole scene the end of the scene is so iconic, they used it in all three films, because it's at the end of the second one, and it's the recap of the beginning of the third. And as it often happens when Doc makes experiments, everything catches on fire. And we cut here, and we don't notice until the helicopter comes by that we've cut to the new 1985. The revised timeline, where the ledge is still broken. And we got the California Raisins having their product placement in there. And the hobo, who shows up in part 2 as well. There's a rumor that this hobo was supposed to be Red Thomas, the mayor from 1955, but it's not. Confirmed by the Bobs. That was not intended to be Red Thomas. Just a bum. Ah, yes, the orgy American style is back. So I guess that Bank of America clock must have been off. And of course, it also raises the question of what time are you returning to? Because, like, it depends on, like, your time zone and, you know, daylight saving time and stuff like that. But again, that's too much to think about. Well, there's the Libyans. Somehow, so he runs, 2 miles in 11 minutes? Whatever. And here you'll see, it's no longer Twin Pines Mall, but Lone Pine Mall, as he ran over the pine tree earlier on in the film. And of course, he doesn't make it, and Doc still gets shot. But in this timeline, Doc had the foreknowledge and wore his bulletproof vest. So it used to be like, why does he just throw himself there? But my friends were like, it's because he's trying to avoid the gunfire. And I'm like, oh, that actually makes sense. Because before I just thought he just like threw himself off the cliff, like Princess Bride style. And of course, we see the alternate perspective here, where after that, the Libyans crash into this little film sale stand. And I guess they're just stuck there because they never show up in this scene again. Also, the bulletproof vest probably shouldn't be able to, like, save him from, like, that high-powered automatic weapon. Again, I'm saying all these things not because I don't like the movie. Like I said, this is my favorite movie, but when you've seen it as many times as I have, you've noticed things. And trust me, I've seen this movie at least 80 times. That's not an exaggeration. Well, Doc isn't quite so, like, low-key about the whole time travel thing later on in 2 and 3, but that could be a result of his rejuvenated youth. Doc's gonna go on some solo time travel adventures. I'm pretty sure some of those are covered in the Back to the Future comics. I've always wanted to read the comics. I hear they're really good, but I can never find like the first issues to start with. I'm honestly surprised there aren't as many Back to the Future stories as I think could be told, but I also think that's about the Bobs trying to keep the integrity of the films intact, which they've done a very good job at. And then, of course, we got Huey Lewis's Back in Time playing when he wakes up, which is a funny joke. He's wearing the same clothes, but everything's different. And then we've got now Dave is now working at an office. Wow. Breakfast. It seems like Marty isn't really like his whole life isn't really affected by this, except for the fact that his family is a lot more functional. Crispin Glover did not like the outfit that the new timeline 1985 George got. The one he would have preferred was the one that's on the back of his book cover, that he looks like a nerdy professor. He tried to convince the crew to like make him wear that instead, but they didn't go with it. Some European critics commented on the end of this film, saying that like his happiness was measured by the materialistic success of the family at the end of the film, and it's very true. That's sort of an 80s mindset where it's like, you know, you have all this nice furniture, and he's got a BMW and a 4x4, and that's the sign of success and happiness. And of course, that's not necessarily the case, but it's an interesting observation. I don't think it's really materialistic, though. I think just in general, the fact that their family is happier than they were before is more emblematic of it. And of course, Biff gets his comeuppance by waxing his cars. Although I don't really know why they would they would say it's because of Biff that they got married. Like, I mean, Biff almost tried to like rape Lorraine. Like, that's kind of a big deal. Yeah. And here we go, the 4x4. Now, this, like, from that shot onward to, like, the end of the film was all recreated 4 years later when they shot Back to the Future Part 2. And maybe I'll do a commentary track on those as well, if you guys like this one. A lot has happened with Marty. His parents are much happier. Now, this whole bit at the end, where he's like, you gotta go to the future, something's wrong with your kids, it was all originally meant as a joke. Like, it wasn't actually supposed to be, like, set up for a sequel. Like, now it runs on garbage and not nuclear power. Mr. Fusion instead of Mr. Coffee. Like, this was all meant to be a joke. It wasn't actually meant to set up the sequel, because otherwise, like they said, they wouldn't have put Jennifer in the car. They just would have had Doc and Marty go off on their own adventures. So they sort of had to write around that when they were doing part 2. And they also never really wanted to show the future in a movie anyway, because there's no way you can get it right. And the flying car at the end, again, it's just like a joke. But Back to the Future was such a big success that a sequel had to be made, and so they figured if a sequel's going to be made, we might as well do it, and we might as well do it right. And that's what led to Back to the Future Part 2 and 3, which was actually shot back-to-back off of one script that was split in 2. But that's a story for another day. The film ends with Huey Lewis and the News with Back in Time, their second song for the film. So yeah, that was my commentary of Back to the Future, or Back to the Future Part 1, rather. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I sort of came up with the idea of doing this because I like talking over movies that I know a lot about. Back to the Future probably being the movie I know the most about. So I figured I'd just give it a go and just talk over it and keep it sort of laid back and fun, and I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, so just let me know in the comments. Yeah. Alright. I love Back to the Future. I hope I'll probably do 2 and 3, and some other films as well. We'll see. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. This is SoLinkSmash signing off. Thank you for listening.